Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a really interesting stack of sources you've gathered for us,
Hmm.
all exploring our inner world through, well, this model called internal family systems, or IFS.
Right.
And what's compelling here, I think, is that this isn't just theory. The sources lay out these principles, they almost feel like laws of inner physics.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And they show how these laws apply, especially when we're, dealing with the really difficult parts of ourselves.
Exactly. And these sources are super practical, actually. They give real insights into handling intense emotions, tricky beliefs inside.
Mm-hmm.
And they suggest a path that's, well, maybe counterintuitive compared to how we usually try to manage things like anxiety or, shame.
Right. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. Let's unpack these sources, pull out the key nuggets, the really important stuff,
Uh-huh.
and figure out what these laws tell us about working with our own inner landscape, especially those, challenging inner experiences we all bump into.
Okay, let's get into it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The sources kick off with the basic IFS idea. We're not just one single self.
Right. We have these subpersonalities, these parts.
And then there's the self that's like our core wise essence. The you that's calm, curious, compassionate,
Yeah.
your best self, kind of.
That's the one. And a key concept they bring up is blending.
Ah, yeah. Blending, that's when a part just takes over completely. So much so that you basically become it in that moment.
Exactly. They use that powerful example from A Beautiful Mind, John Nash and his paranoid parture.
Right. When Parcher blends, the movie actually shows us the world through his eyes, through the delusion.
And the sources point out, interestingly, that for Nash, just learning to recognize Parcher and kind of keep him at arm's length, that helped him function much better later on.
Which sounds a bit like, some mindfulness approaches, creating space from the thoughts or feelings.
He's similar, yeah.
Fair.
But here's where IFS, according to this material, takes a really different turn. It suggests you don't just manage or ignore the part. Even a part like Parcher, as scary as he seems.
So what do you do?
In therapy, you'd actually go towards that part. You try to connect with it, understand why it's doing, what it's protecting.
Which brings us right to one of those core laws of inner physics. The sources really hammer home.
Uh-huh. The first one. Whenever a part agrees not to totally flood you, it won't.
Okay, wait, hang on. That sounds incredibly simple, maybe too simple. Because my experience, and I bet for a lot of you listening, is when you're overwhelmed by a feeling, by a part, you feel completely out of control. There's no agreement.
You've hit exactly why the sources say this is tough for people to buy into initially.
Yeah.
When you feel completely swamped, maybe an exile part with deep pain surfaces or a protector part just takes the wheel, it genuinely feels like you have zero control. Zero.
It feels impossible that the part has a choice in how intense it gets.
But the sources are really clear on this. They say this law has, never been proven false in decades of clinical work.
Never.
Wow.
That's what they claim. And the value of knowing this, especially in therapy, is huge. Think about working with someone who's maybe very fragile, holding trauma,
Uh-huh.
or someone with significant diagnoses who's just terrified of being overwhelmed by what's inside. This law lets you approach their system gently.
So instead of immediately trying to, ground them.
Right. Instead of jumping to grounding, you start by simply asking the part that's causing the distress, whatever it is, if it would be willing to just dial it back a tiny bit. Not go away, just not flood.
And if it agrees,
Yeah.
it just stops overwhelming you.
That's the principle. The sources say if the part agrees, it will not totally overwhelm the person.
Okay, but why would a part agree? Especially a protector part that thinks it has to take over to keep you safe. Like Parcher.
That's the crucial piece. Parts often overwhelm because they genuinely believe they must take control for protection. Or maybe they're scared that if they show up without taking over, they'll just get pushed away or locked up again.
Like the vulnerable exile parts they're guarding? Exactly. But when you approach them from self with that curiosity, compassion, calm, and you just ask them not to flood, you're sending a different message.
What message?
That you're willing to be present with them. You're not trying to shut them down or banish them. You're offering connection, understanding.
The sources have this really clear example, right? A panic attack starting in a session.
Yeah, vivid.
The usual reaction might be quick grounding techniques, get them out of it.
Right. But the IFS approach described is different. It's about noticing the scared part that is panicking, welcoming it, acknowledging it's there, and then asking that part if it could just separate its energy a little bit. just enough.
So the person can be present with the panic, look at it, instead of being the panic.
Precisely. And the sources say more often than not, the panicked part trusts that request.
Really?
Yeah. Suddenly the client feels self-led again, connected to their core self, and they can feel compassion for the part that was panicking. So they are grounded, present with the feeling, but not lost in it anymore.
Okay, so let's loop back to John Nash. If he's in a session talking about Percher, you wouldn't argue with the delusion, you wouldn't just try to ground him.
No, according to this model, you'd invite him from self, if possible, to connect with the part telling him those things, Parcher.
Even though he might say, Parcher isn't a part, Parcher's me.
Exactly. That's the blending. But with patience and a therapist guiding, he might start to differentiate. Then, from self, you'd ask Parcher, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't take over? What are you protecting? You'd reassure Parcher that if he allowed Nash to stay present, they could work together to understand and heal whatever underlying pain Parcher's managing.
And the sources mention this might take time for a part like Parcher to trust that.
Oh, absolutely. Trust isn't instant, especially with heavily burdened parts. But the principle holds. Eventually, Nash might be able to see Parcher, like he did later in life when he managed better.
See him across the room, not be him.
Exactly. And from that self-led place, Nash could appreciate Parcher's protective role, understand his motives, and then real healing could start. This first law is like the key to unlocking that relationship.
Wow, that's a powerful idea, that the parts can choose their intensity. Okay,
Right.
So that's law number 1. Parts can control overwhelm if asked. What's the second big law the sources talk about?
The second one is just as counterintuitive, maybe even more so. And again, the sources say it's never been proven false.
Okay, we're ready.
Nothing inside of you has any power if you are in self-protection and not afraid of it.
Nothing. That feels like a really big claim. What about parts that feel incredibly powerful, destructive even?
It is a big claim, but the sources back it up with clinical experience. They talk about working with clients who had parts that felt like, actual monsters or demons inside.
Wow.
Parts dead set on hurting the client or maybe others. Yet, when the client could access self and be present with that part without fear, the part's usual tactics, the intimidation, the threats, they seemed almost weak, feeble. Because from self, the client could see through the scary facade to the part's true nature.
Which was often.
Often, a young, terrified part stuck in a really difficult role, carrying a heavy burden.
So the fear isn't just a side effect. The fear actually gives the part its power over you.
That's the core idea. And the sources add a really critical warning here.
Okay.
If a person is afraid, if they're blended with fear or another part, then yes, these parts, especially the ones with really nasty burdens, they can have immense power.
Power to do real harm.
Yes. Power to cause self-harm, harm to others, to really sabotage a life. So being in self and unafraid isn't about pretending the part isn't there or minimizing its potential.
Right.
It's about relating to it from your own core strength, clarity, and crucially, your own sense of inner safety.
And being in that centered, unafraid place, that's what allows the parts to open up. The sources call it revealing their secret histories.
Exactly that. When the inner system feels safe, because self is present and not intimidated, parts don't feel the need to maintain their extreme defenses.
They can let their guard down a bit.
Right. They can start to show you how they got forced into these extreme roles, maybe reveal the vulnerable exiles they're fiercely protecting, the burdens they carry.
And that's the path to transformation.
That's what opens the door. Understanding leads to healing.
Okay. Those 2 laws feel huge. Foundational. Parts can manage overwhelm if asked, and nothing has power over self if self isn't afraid. So the sources then shift gears, right, to applying this to maybe the toughest stuff.
Yeah, they pivot to working with parts we feel the most shame or fear about. They frame it as advanced protector work, and they use inner racism as a really specific and potentially quite challenging example.
Right. That sounds intense.
It can be. The setup they describe involves getting comfortable, maybe checking in with parts you already know, establishing that internal sense of safety first.
Makes sense. You need to be grounded.
Definitely. And then they introduce this concept of a legacy burden of racism.
Okay, what's that mean exactly?
It's not about personal blame, like you're a bad person. It's acknowledging that our culture, our society, our history, it's embedded certain racist patterns and beliefs inside many of us.
Regardless of our own race or how much anti-racism work we've done.
Exactly. It's about how these societal things become internalized. So the exercise invites you to just notice. Is there a racist part inside?
A part that holds, like, white supremacist ideas or makes racist judgments or says nasty things internally.
Could be any of that,
Yeah.
subtle or overt. The sources suggest that even people who consciously reject racism might find a part like this if they look with patience and, importantly, curiosity, not judgment.
And the crucial first step, they say, is not to try and get close to it right away.
No, definitely not. That would likely just trigger a flood of other protective parts: shame, fear, denial.
So those protectors jump in to shield you from the racist part.
Often, yes. So the very first step is just to notice from self. How do I feel towards this part? And notice those other protectors that pop up.
And you need to work with those protectors first. The shame, the fear.
You need to acknowledge them, thank them for trying to protect you, and then gently reassure them.
Reassure them about what?
That allowing connection to the racist part from self is actually the way to help it change. And crucially, that trying to shame it or exile it or pretend it doesn't exist, that just doesn't work.
It just pushes it underground, makes it unconscious.
Exactly. Creates more implicit bias, more blind spots you're not even aware of. Fighting it, the sources say, just strengthens it or makes it hide better.
So what's the alternative then?
It might be that simply acknowledging its existence from self and making a commitment to eventually work with it, maybe with therapeutic help, that might be enough for a long time.
Just acknowledging it.
Yeah. And reinforcing those core IFS ideas. It's just a part, not all of you. It can be worked with. It can transform. There's no shame in having, it's often carrying this cultural legacy burden. And it's likely protecting something vulnerable or just carrying the burden directly.
The author shares their own experience here, which feels really significant.
It does. They talk about having a background in civil rights, progressive stuff, and still being mortified to find a racist part inside themselves. They found it one of the hardest parts to work with, and they still get hits from it sometimes that need gentle countering.
Sharing that feels like it lowers the defenses for the listener, maybe. Makes it safer to look.
But I think that's the intention, to depolarize it, like they say. It's not about being good or bad. It's about seeing how these cultural things land inside us.
And the key message until it's unburdened is awareness.
Awareness, yes.
Yeah.
Actively reminding yourself, okay, that's that part. I see it. It's not me. Not going to war with it, because fighting it just digs it in deeper.
And this whole approach, curiosity, compassion, not fighting it, applies to other shamed parts too, right? Not just racism.
And absolutely. The sources list examples.
Yeah.
Parts with embarrassing fantasies, parts holding political views you disagree with.
Like the example they used of a part that thinks Donald Trump is great, acknowledging it internally, not endorsing it.
Exactly. Seeing it as an internal phenomenon to understand, or parts that get a kick out of others failing, or parts holding other prejudices like misogyny. The underlying message is the same. These are often like young, misguided inner kids. They're acting out or holding strange beliefs because they're hurt or confused. They need guidance and understanding from self, not more rejection.
Okay, to make this really concrete, the sources provide a session transcript with someone named Andy.
Yeah, and Andy's involved in anti-racism work himself, which makes it even more powerful.
Yeah.
He volunteers even though he feels vulnerable.
Kind of walking the walk, as they put it.
Right. And the therapist helps him find the part or parts carrying racist beliefs.
And he finds two, not just one.
That's right. One he feels around my mouth and lips, and another that's harder to locate initially around my spine.
Okay, let's start with the mouth-lips one. What was that about?
Andy connects with it, and right away he feels compassion for it. It feels young, maybe 5 or 6 years old.
And it's linked to a specific memory?
Yes, a restaurant memory. It was the first time this little boy from a really sheltered background had ever seen a black person.
Okay.
And with total childlike innocence, he asked the adult he was with, why is his skin dirty?
Oh, wow. Kids say things like that. How did the adult react?
Badly. Immediate embarrassment. Pulled the boy away fast, apologized over and over to the black man, and then told the boy very sternly never to ask questions like that.
Ooh. So the child's natural curiosity got completely shamed.
Totally. And the sources say the burden this part carried became fear. Fear of hurting that adult again and fear of hurting people with that skin color just by being curious. Curiosity itself became dangerous and hurtful in his young mind.
So how did they help this young part?
The therapist guided Andy as his adult self to go back into that memory.
Okay.
He helped the little boy part revisit it and asked the boy what he really needed or wanted in that moment.
And what was that?
Surprisingly, the boy wanted the two men the adult he was with and the black man to somehow connect with each other.
Interesting.
So Andy, from Self, facilitated that connection within the inner scene. The sources say the boy part felt really happy, complete when that happened.
And then the unburdening, letting go of the fear.
Yeah, the part was ready. He agreed to give up the fear and the belief that his curiosity was bad. Andy felt it physically in his throat. He let it go, imagined sending it to light.
And the result?
The boy part felt happy and light. Andy felt more courage in his body, and the part brought this insight. Adults can be hurting too, and maybe he could help adults connect.
Wow. Okay, that's one part. What about the second one? The one around his spine, the scarier one.
Right, that one was harder to get a handle on. Felt scary to Andy, like a snake or a rope coiled around his spine.
So applying that second law here, relating from self without fear.
Exactly. The therapist helped Andy access self, approach the scary feeling with curiosity. Once he did that, the part started revealing its own fear.
What was it afraid of?
It was terrified of being seen. It believed if Andy really saw it, people Andy loved would get hurt, maybe retaliate. So it felt safer being invisible, just coiled up, hiding.
And what was this part doing? What were its beliefs?
It was the part that sometimes had automatic thoughts, judging people based on appearance, skin color, features. And the part knew these thoughts were hurtful.
So it was generating these thoughts, but from a place of hiding and fear. Where did it come from?
Its origin story went back to middle school, around age 13.
Middle school. Always tough.
Tell me about it. And it felt like an exile back then, picked on for his weight, his interests, who he hung out with, who wouldn't hang out with him.
Painful.
Yeah. So this part developed a defense mechanism to cope with that pain of being excluded. Its strategy was to judge others.
To feel better about himself.
Exactly. To create an internal ranking system where he could always find a way to feel better than other people. It was a survival strategy born out of being treated badly and feeling like he had to hide.
So the judgmental thoughts, the inner racism, it was a protective shield developed because he felt exiled and humiliated.
That's the understanding that emerged. Andy recognized it immediately, said it makes a lot of sense. The part then showed him this specific painful memory.
What was it?
A lunchroom scene. He and his friends were being openly mocked and disdained by a popular girl. He felt himself shrink, felt humiliated, angry.
Ow, how did they work with that memory?
Andy, from his adult self, went into the scene. He helped his 13-year-old self see that the popular girl's cruelty probably came from her own pain or insecurity.
Helping him see her differently.
Right. And he helped the boy understand that he did have the strength to stand up to people like her, even if they seemed powerful. Once he offered that support and perspective within the scene, the boy part felt ready to leave the past and come into the present.
And was this part ready to unburden too?
Yes. The burden felt like being physically hunched over in his shoulders and neck, unable to look people in the eye. He released that, imagined sending it to fire. And Andy reported feeling physically taller afterwards, like a foot taller.
Wow, physical change.
Yeah. And the part brought a new perspective. Seeing that popular girl's pain, understanding her strategy was to shit on us to feel better, and realizing if he ever acted that way, he could recognize it and apologize. He felt more self-confident.
That session is incredibly illuminating. Two distinct parts, both linked to inner racism, but from totally different roots. One, shamed curiosity, the other, a defense against personal pain.
It really shows the complexity, doesn't it? And reinforces that core idea. Fighting these parts doesn't work. Listening, understanding their story, leading from self, that's the path. Even if it requires firm, loving discipline sometimes, compassion is key. Parts have so many different reasons for holding beliefs or acting in certain ways.
The sources also make a quick mention of something else, those negative voices that don't quite feel like a full part.
Right, unattached burdens or interjects. Sometimes it's more like an internalized critical voice or a negative image. Feels kind of two-dimensional.
Like absorbing negativity from outside.
Kind of, yeah. Maybe internalized hatred or criticism. But the same principle applies that second law. If you're in self and not afraid of them, the sources say they don't have power over you either.
Okay. And finally, the sources wrap up with some really crucial advice on self-care after doing this kind of deep work.
Absolutely essential. Stirring up your inner world like this can leave things feeling unsettled. And it's such a different way of relating to yourself that can be disorienting, especially if people around you don't get it.
So what kind of self-care do they suggest?
Patience, first off. especially with parts that might be skeptical or worried about all this exploration.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Holding inner meetings, just taking quiet time to check in, let parts know. Self is there and cares. Asking parts what they need in the outside world.
Like what?
Maybe needing space from certain people, or more connection with others, time in nature, gentle movement, yoga, meditation, baths. Just listening to what feels supportive to the system.
They even mentioned checking with parts about medication.
Yeah, and a neuropsychiatrist asking parts directly if meds feel helpful or harmful. It's about bringing that same respect and curiosity
Huh.
to all aspects of well-being,
Huh.
honoring the wisdom within the whole system.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really taken us on a journey from understanding parts and blending to those two big laws, parts managing overwhelm and self being unafraid.
Right, the power of self.
And then seeing how it all applies in practice, working with really tough stuff like inner racism,
Yeah.
using Andy's session as such a clear example.
And the common thread through everything, really, is this shift in perspective. Approaching the difficult, scary, shameful stuff inside, not with a battle plan,
Yeah.
but with the curiosity and compassion of your core self.
Yeah.
That seems to be the key that unlocks healing and transformation, according to these sources.
It definitely lays out a very different way to relate to those parts of yourself you might usually just try to push away or ignore.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over after hearing all this.
Okay.
What parts of yourself do you instinctively try to avoid or battle or pretend aren't there?
Yeah.
And what might happen? What might shift? If you just tried, from that calm, curious self place, asking one of those parts if it would be willing to just show it a tiny bit. Not to overwhelm you, just enough so you could listen. What might you discover?